vocationally orientated you make an educational system, the more you push aside ethics, the arts, the humanities, the social sciences. I heard recently an academic from the University of Queensland produced a report, and he said all this criticism of the arts and there's an assault on the arts and humanities is nonsense. He actually said that 65% of undergraduate enrolments are in the arts, humanities and social sciences. We can quibble about that, but the point to be made here is about what is being taught. Now, if you look at what happened at La Trobe University, for example, where I understand they gutted the humanities and they reconfigured it so it could actually become a training ground for job-ready graduates. That's the mindset of a lot of universities now. The only reason they'll actually put on courses is if they actually linked up to the dominant imperative, which is actually getting people into work and actually hooking into the neoliberal economy and GDP and economic growth and so forth. But I think there is a real danger in the way that curricula are structured and the commodification, what I call the commodification of critique, of de-intellectualizing students and also de-radicalizing them. You know, the days where you could sort of spend time with students debating ideas that would actually lead them to some form of activism, I think are increasingly over. You know, I think one of the concerns I have, there was a book that came out a couple of years ago which referred to the zombification of students. I thought it was a bit unkind, you know, given that I actually teach in a social work school. But I think there is the fact that young people now have grown up under 20 or 30 years of neoliberalism, and they have inherited and internalized a lot of neoliberal values, and it's really quite problematic.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and it's one that always makes me a bit uncomfortable. Because I think that when we start stressing the, humanistic values and the ways in which university education can foster a democratic spirit in its graduates, there's a risk which we have to be very careful not to fall into. And that risk is that we end up implying that it's only the middle classes that are the sort of repositories or reservoirs of, critique and dissent and the sort of, homes of democracy and the centre of gravity for progressive social change in society. I think that given the, class composition of the subjects which are most essentially associated with those things, critique, dissent.
Free universal education.
Well, I absolutely believe in free universal education. I absolutely believe in that. And so I don't want to say that, if we stop teaching Latin or if we stop teaching philosophy or English literature and instead we just teach dentistry, we're immediately going to end up with a less political, political culture, a less political citizenry, a more disengaged and more compliant one. I'm sort of sometimes tempted to think that, and I think there's some grain of truth in it, but I think we need to recognise that, social change comes from below, on the whole. It doesn't come from university graduate, it comes from trade unionists occupying and going on strike, on the whole. So my real concern about the democratic, damage that's being done is what happens to students' opportunities for intellectual growth if they're squeezed into a narrowly vocationally defined set of subject choices. This seems to me to represent a particular kind of brutalisation of the intelligence, which is an intrinsic affront to democracy because it's a form of intellectual violence.
Just a question about the prodigious growth of the Australian higher education system, the massification of higher education, to use a terrible word. Richard, you mentioned the oversupply of people with credentials to labour markets which cannot ever absorb them. But I'm thinking about things like the growth of youth unemployment and the fact that for a very large proportion of Australia's young people, they have nowhere else to go but post-school education. One of the things that's been revealed in the debate about higher education has been the extent to which this is now a popular mass concern, not just a marginal concern, an elite concern, but a popular mass concern. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, both of you, about the idea that the first 3 years of post-school education are now effectively an extension of the compulsory education system. That we've seen a watering down of the value of credentials over a period, such that now, you know, not very much can be achieved with an undergraduate degree, and much of the training for which we used to conduct the training in 3 years after school now has to be done at postgraduate level. And whether this in fact reveals the completely false notion of private benefit, especially for those from working class backgrounds who, you know, who are placed less well than anyone else in society to take advantage of credentials they may have. So that's a question about essentially the Melbourne model of higher education, where you try to look upon university education, post-school education generally, as you know, the first stage towards a career rather than a ready-made credential in itself.
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer just briefly because we've talked about this, George. I mean, as you know, I support, as the gentleman behind you said, I support free universal education and at tertiary level, and one of the reasons is exactly that there's not very much you can do with, you know, a high school degree, and there's even not very much you can do with an undergraduate degree, but at the very least, it's the least you need to be able to get some sort of footing in the economy. And for no other reason than that, I think we have to insist that people should have equal access to those first 3 years of an undergraduate degree.
Just 2 points, Phil. I concur with those comments, and it's interesting to note that Germany has actually reverted back to free higher education because of large-scale public protests against the privatisation of that system. Sweden operates a wonderful higher education system, and from what I understand, it's not an impoverished country, it's not gone to the wall. It certainly hasn't got the $1.3 trillion debt which American students have, and certainly 17% of students in Australia, according to figures last year, didn't manage to pay their debts, and that's going to increase, of course, with if and when the fees go up. Look, I think there's a whole bunch of other issues around this. The thing about, I feel a great deal of empathy for those students who, those young people who find themselves now with Abbott's threat of actually, which I think he's rescinded now, of not receiving any state support whilst they're unemployed or looking for jobs. And then going to a university system with all its kind of narrow, rigidified educational curricula designed to obtain jobs which they actually may not be able to get once they graduate. I mean, this is a kind of double whammy for students, and it's an awful scenario. The other thing you need to note is about the entry requirements of universities themselves. Now, you'll all be aware. Okay, I'll just give you one example. You know, New South Wales government's been jumping up and down, as have other state and territory governments, about entry requirements for teachers. You know, saying, you know, isn't it terrible that some teachers, you know, have got less than 70 ATARs, you know, scores when they go to university. Now, this is a very common observation. And when Fred Hilmer at the University of New South Wales tried to put in a score across the board, I think it was about 80, he was howled down as well. Now look, I find myself in this incredible position now of arguing for standards. You know, when I was at university undergraduate, I was thinking, this is terrible bourgeois tyranny, you know. But now I'm thinking, well, if places like Southern Cross University, Charles Sturt University are allowing students in on ATARs of 30, and I kid you not, I mean, that is fairly low, and in any common language that would constitute an outright disastrous fail, worse than the one I had in mathematics when I was at school, then, you know, it raises some questions. Look, my view is the whole debate around standards of entry, now we can get into the arguments about patriarchy and elitism and all that stuff, but we need to revisit it, and we need to revisit what is a higher education, higher in relation to what, because that notion has been totally, utterly obliterated since the marketisation of universities. The idea that there is a standard to enter into higher education is a complete nonsense. Maybe we don't need it, but I think we need a public discussion about it.
I wanted to go back to the first question that was asked. The link between jobs and whatever it is that universities produce, and the possibility that one might judge the utility of universities on the basis of whether or not the graduates get jobs. The fact is that in many, many developed countries, people coming out of universities are not getting jobs. But then a lot of other people aren't getting jobs either. And what I want to highlight is recent work in the United States in economics, and also in Australia, which hardly ever gets any airing. And that is the increasing tendency, and very substantial tendency, of large corporations to involve themselves not in using their retained earnings to diversify and expand their firms, but to indulge in buyback of their shares and the issue of dividends. So the firm now is becoming not a vehicle for the production of goods and services for the community, but an opportunity for private individuals, increasingly well paid, to enrich themselves. Now the consequence of that is that the number of jobs in a whole range of areas are disappearing. This isn't to do with technology. And if we look at some of the commentary on Piketty and capital in the 21st century, one of the commentaries makes this astonishing point, that there is in fact no way that education can overcome the difficulties of inequality. That is a frightening statement. However, we don't need to get that bad, that worried. I'd like some commentary, some response on those points, and also on, as I understand, and I'm sorry we were late, I don't think you dealt with the corporatisation of universities, of which the behaviour of the sainted vice-chancellors are merely an outgrowth or a symptom. There are problems within universities which I think are not addressed, and one of those, a major one of those, is the quality of the teaching, and another is the quality of the leadership. But to finish, every proposal by Christopher Pyne is an outrageous assault on our intelligence.
There's a lot of stuff there, obviously. Perhaps this is a bit doctrinaire, but I mean, it does seem to me an accurate generalisation to say that education is not going to overcome inequality. Education confers certain sorts of intellectual benefits on its recipients. The thing that's going to fix up inequality is material change in the structures of production and distribution of wealth in society, and education is obviously not fit to bring that about on its own, obviously. So I agree with that analysis, and that I suppose links into the remarks that I was making before about the dangers of trying to locate in universities, and hence, and particularly in humanities subjects, and hence in the sort of, entitled middle classes, the great hope for, the salvation of society. I think that's a real misreading, it seems to me. I can't address everything else you've said. Perhaps I can just say something briefly, if you don't mind, about teaching quality. Because of course it's the case that, every university bureaucrat is very interested in teaching quality and is on a crusade to, allegedly improve it. But we need to see this for what it is. And the fundamental recognition that I think has to be at the start of any discussion about this topic is that you can't measure it. Teaching quality cannot be measured. It's a hermeneutic relationship between a teacher and a student. It's dependent on all sorts of hidden variables. It's probably not objective. Whether someone has learnt something or not may well in many domains not even be an objective, there may not be an objective fact of the matter about it, unless we're talking about the most sort of elementary cases of drilling, where you're teaching a student to perform some very mechanical procedure which you could automate the the assessment of. So I think that is not obviously that recognition, the hermeneutic quality of teaching quality and its consequent inability to be actually measured, completely goes against the entire ideology of everything that, you know, that animates how universities think of themselves. But I think it's in coming to terms with that and in thinking deeply about the nature of teaching. If that, not that that's likely to happen, but if that did happen, I think we might actually see some real progress.
Thank you. You're right. I mean, we need to understand the emergence of what's happening in Australia in a sort of more global context, I guess, and to look at ideology and how ideology is practiced and how it manifests in terms of organisational cultures. You're right. Vice-chancellors, we're always picking on them, but there's plenty of other people we can pick on. Pro-vice-chancellors, senior administrators of various sorts, you know. So there's many of them. And, you know, what really gets me going, actually, is the hypocrisy, the rank hypocrisy of the vice-chancellors. I'm always raging against them. These are people, I assume, a significant proportion of them, and they're mostly male, of course, and from middle-class backgrounds, so let's not go there. But most of them would have had free education, I suspect. Most of them probably would have spent time on campus. Most of them would have enjoyed all the benefits of university life back in the, you know, the elitist patriarchal days in the 60s and 70s. And now, who have they become? Well, these transformed characters who kind of mimic the corporate world. As their CEOs, Glyn Davis on $1.3 million salary, thank you very much. You know, I think this is wrong. You know, I tried to calculate, actually, as Nick was talking, I was trying to do a brief calculation in my mind of if we talk about fee deregulation, we need to have a salary deregulation, you know, or to regulate salaries rather, which is, let's calculate how much senior management at universities, how much they actually get in terms of income, not only in terms of the literal income, but in terms of, you know, corporate credit cards, subsidised housing and the rest of it, which would, and pro-vice chancellors and the rest would probably run into tens of millions of dollars, which would probably you know, benefit a lot of students. Look, I think there's a really important discussion to be had here, and actually Henry, what's his name? Henry Giroux and others, many others have already done the analysis, and to some degree I don't think we need to go there, because the analysis of where the neoliberal university, of which Australian system is a part, how that fits into the globalised corporate system is incredibly clear. I think what we need, in terms of what Nick was saying, is to really think strategically about how to respond to some of this stuff. I think the National Alliance for the Public Universities is a really incredibly important organisation which we should actually build on. We should also build on some of the insights of some senior academics. I'll just give you one example, if I may. I went to a conference, and the most radical, outspoken, insightful person I met was a professor of accounting at the University of Western Sydney. I don't know if he's here. He was quite brilliant. And he spent most of his time on academic board and in other universities committees, you know, undermining these neoliberal arguments and disrupting the kind of language and this hegemonic order to which they all adhere. And I think there's a strong case for us all doing that. But I think this organisation, which Nick and others are a part of, is really, really worth thinking about. And if you're an academic, make sure you try and join it.
Yeah. I wonder whether it's worth discussing the onslaught of neoliberalism on higher education without at the same time talking about the onslaught on TAFE and vocational and further education. Because I think it's two sides of one coin, and it's also about the way work is valued in our society. The people who are in a position to define the value of work, like our $1 million Vice-Chancellor, obviously define certain forms of work as highly valuable and difficult. Other forms of work which are just as difficult, particularly work done by women, are defined as worth far less and therefore not needing the same salary and not needing the same training. Why shouldn't a bricklayer or a nurse or a childcare worker have the same access to critical knowledge, the ability to critique what we're fed by the ruling class, as someone who's a surgeon or a psychologist or whatever. I think we need to put the two together and to see that education really has two main functions. One is to learn a skill useful to society, and the other is to learn what it takes to be a critical citizen. And that needs to be throughout the workforce and throughout the education system, not just in the university part of it. I think the attempt to destroy TAFE, which we saw particularly in Victoria, and which is being done in a watered-down form in New South Wales, is just as dangerous as what's happening to higher education.
I'm going to take the Tony Jones technique and take that as a valuable comment, and take, I mean, it really is very important what you've just said, and take no more than two more questions. Who's? Yeah, sorry.
I have two questions. Christopher Pine.
I'm in two people.
So Christopher Pine, he thinks that if his reforms don't get passed, then universities will slide into mediocrity. Is this true? And my second question is, given the fact that none of the universities in Australia are in the top 20 in the world, why is the government so obsessed with competition rather than the benefits higher education gives?
Yeah, well, look, today I actually just talking about this global competition thing. There's a friend of mine actually said that she's reading in England. She said that she used to read this satirical column by Laurie Taylor in the Times Higher Education supplement. She goes, there's no need for it anymore because you just open the pages and read what's in the normal pages, you know. And the same applies, you read Campus Review or read The Australian, it's all satire, the whole paper, you know. It's self-satire.
It's not funny though, is it?
It's not funny though, no, it's miserable. But I forgot what I was going to say now. Now, today, what did I read today? Well, I read something, I couldn't believe it, I nearly choked on my cornflakes actually. There was something about, and there's a very celebratory article in the Sydney Morning Herald, and it said that Melbourne now is ranked 51st in the world in terms of the reputational ranking. And I thought, what on earth is this? You know, the reputational ranking, it's absurd. You know, and you know, all these rankings are so absurd, they're meaningless. You know, I remember not so long ago, I actually had a bit of a ding-dong with Simon Marginson about this. You know, and Simon's kind of seen, I don't know how he positions himself in terms of world rankings. I think he was an advisor to one of the universities at one point, so it made it a bit difficult for him. But, you know, this thing about, you know, you make your reputation on the back, for example, of how many citations you get. You know, and I actually asked a very obvious question. I said, well, most of the articles I write, I cite people, that's because I disagree with them. You know, I cite them. I said, did you take that into account? He goes, oh no. I said, well, you know, I find that sort of a bit Python-esque, quite frankly. But, you know, so I don't think we should take this world ranking stuff very seriously.
Not only shouldn't we take it seriously, we should denounce it as arrant nonsense and do everything we can to stop people, you know, even referring to it. I mean, and I think if you think about it, even, you know, superficially, it rapidly becomes clear what nonsense it can only be. So I'm not going to, I agree with Richard about that, but I'd be very happy if we never heard anything more about where a university putatively stands in some confected list of, you know, of ranks. The question of quality and mediocrity is obviously what the deregulation proponents have thought is their trump card that they can play. They can say, look, deregulate or we're going to slide into mediocrity, we're going to slide into, you know, we're going to sacrifice the wonderful quality that we currently have in the Australian higher education sector. I don't know what that means. I don't really know how higher education quality could be measured either. Universities are like golf courses. You know, some you like, some you don't. There's a significant element, not that I play golf, I hasten to add.
I thought you were very good with a putter.
But I think there's a significant subjective element. There's a hermeneutic element. It's about judgment, and it's about judgment in a way that can't be disciplined by sort of objective measures that you can quantify, because people are always going to disagree. Even within the sciences, even outside of the humanities, people are going to disagree about what it is that constitutes a quality education in a particular discipline, and there's no way that you can write that subjectivity out of these discussions. So quality, again, is one of these very problematic terms, which is always code for something else. It's always code for something else. But let me say this about it, just to finish off. Even if it was true that Australian universities would slide into mediocrity as a result of deregulation, I would say bring it on. For this reason, that democracy is more important than quality. There's no, I think, ambiguity about that. It is much more important that Australian students all have equal access and equal opportunity to grow intellectually than it is that a small, clique of those students, in other words, those who can afford it, get access to some notionally much better kind of education while the rest are fobbed off with notionally much worse kinds. So democracy and equality is much more important than quality itself, it seems to me.
Okay, last question, I'm afraid.
Okay. Firstly, with the second speaker, when you talk, it seemed as though a lot of our intellectual arguments, which are actually quite wise and quite valid, seem to somehow get filtered very heavily once they approach Canberra. So my question firstly is the use of ridicule probably the way to go, at least for now, with the current government? For example, calling them the Incompetencia rather than or the Braille Party rather than the Liberal Party, because there's nothing liberal about what they're saying, right? And secondly, I'm surprised at how many people don't seem to appreciate, especially the Vice-Chancellors, that if the best students, once they graduate, the most productive students are the ones that have broad range of skills, who are critical thinkers, to be able to adapt and develop new technologies that are beyond even what they were doing in the first place. But there doesn't seem to be an appreciation, especially from people in Canberra or even the corporate world, that once you get out of your little nepotistic sort of environment, like say Australia, and you look more in terms of an international level, for example, it is only the skills of high competence and value that comes through rather than through inner circles. So how on earth are we going to get our leaders to start to appreciate that a lot of these things actually long-term, intergenerational, and also a long-term approach rather than the very short-term thinking that, like you're saying about Christopher Pyne, who's very much in terms of his political benefit rather than actually thinking about the rest.
Yeah, look, I won't answer the question, other than to say that I think that just engaging with mainstream parties on political debate about higher education, I'm not all that interested in it actually, because we've seen their records, both Labour and Liberal coalition. So what I think we should have a discussion about is how we can generate a public debate about what universities are for, if they're necessary in their current form. Taking on that point made, that excellent point made by the chap there about TAFE, about the entitlement of everybody to be involved in an education that prepares them for social democratic citizenship and which also offers something called guidance. Some of the most interesting commentary I've come across so far on higher education has come from that populist French philosopher Alain de Botton, where he talked about the absence of guidance, and I kind of winced at it when I first saw it, but I kind of got it as well. This need to kind of engage people in a meaningful, respectful discussion about what it means to be a citizen in a democratic, participatory democratic society. I think that's really important. And look, my view is, if you want my view is that universities in their current form will be increasingly consigned to irrelevance as a result of the great social, economic, political and environmental, particularly environmental transformations which are confronting us.
I agree absolutely with Richard that we shouldn't be, trying to really talk with or appeal to or reason with the major parties. their record is very clear. What we should be trying to do is ridicule them, so I agree with you absolutely. I think that public debate in this country is far too tame. I think we're far too polite. I think that politeness is really the product of conservatism, lack of confidence in our own ideas. I think the left has failed miserably in prosecuting its, ideas about the good life and a better world. And part of doing that effectively is not just having the rational arguments, it's also not hesitating to ridicule its opponents. And I agree with you, absolutely we should do that, and that's an effective rhetorical strategy. If we're talking, but we also have to have the arguments. That we have to have the arguments for when they're needed. If we're trading French philosophers, though, I would say that it's Jacques Rancière and his book, The Ignorant Schoolmaster, which is the single most important thing that I have read and that's influenced my ideas about what education consists in. So I just, trade that with you, Richard, de Botton for Rancière.
They're raising their standard.
I'll raise you a German philosopher.
Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Look, thank you very much. I want to say thank you to the audience. One of the books that influenced me in, I think it was the early 70s, was Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, in which the argument was that a university was where a group of people gathered together and had precisely the kind of debate and question and answer that we've had tonight, even though, according to Nick, we haven't been quite rude enough to one another. I just want to comment, take 60 seconds to do it, on a couple of omissions that concern me. There's no criticism of my colleagues. One is about the seduction that's going on, that technology is going to solve all this, that as soon as we all have a computer chip in our chests and engage in joint ventures with Apple, then some sort of educational nirvana will arrive. The other thing that concerns me is I do want us to internationalise this debate. We have one student from Gaza for the first time ever at Sydney University, and he has left behind 499,000 students with similar intelligence and aspirations who have no prospects whatsoever. And the last time I visited Timor, just up the road, the unemployment rate was at least 50% among the kind of young people who might go to TAFE or might go to university. I'd like to think that we had sufficient vision to reconfigure the notion of joint ventures that didn't involve the corporatization of everything, but rather an urgent sense of partnership with people who have far less prospects than we almost certainly take for granted.